Welcome, everyone, to our last webinar in the series, Animal Health, the Poultry Health series that Dr. David Frame from Utah State University has been doing. My name is Jackie Jacob. I am the coordinator for the E-Extension Small and Backyard Flocks, and I am in charge of making sure we have a monthly webinar. As I said, Dr. Frame has been doing a series for us on um, different aspects of poultry health. Those webinars were recorded and are available online. I will put up the link for that. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available in the near future. Check us out on facebook.com, Poultry Extension, where we post when new webinars are coming and when webinar recordings are available, as well as recent news or events affecting small and backyard flocks. So thank you for joining us. Hopefully we'll get a few more people straggle in at the end, but we like to start on time. So Dr. Frame, it's all yours.
Well, thanks, Jackie, and welcome, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you once again. And as Jackie mentioned, this is the last in the series of poultry diseases and health, and hopefully over the course of the last few months, we've been able to gain a little bit of insight into it. It's kind of hard to put things into a 1-hour package like that, but the topic today is basically I'd like to go over some diseases that we haven't had a chance to cover, at least in their aspects of how it affects the nervous system of poultry. There's some very important things that you need to know about those type of diseases. And then we'll follow that with the review of basic avian immunology. And when I say basic, it'll really be basic because I think that there's a lot that we can cover, but the important things as far as the nuts and bolts are concerned in giving you an idea of why things are done with chicks and with older birds. That's the main thing that we need to cover there. The next thing is just to give you some familiarity with the way the commercial folks vaccinate their birds, and we'll review the vaccination program for layers and for broilers. I think they're the two that would probably be of most concern or of interest there anyway. And then finally we'll discuss what you can do at home and what you should do and what you might not want to do. So with that as the background, I'd like to visit one of the diseases that I get the most calls on, probably from people with chickens in their backyard or small flock owners, and that's Marek's disease. Marek's disease is it's a viral disease. It's caused by herpes virus, and the things that you need to know about this particular disease and what you may read about, it gets a little confusing. So the first thing that we want to let you know about Marek's disease is that it's all over the place. I mean, any place that chickens are raised, they're eventually going to contract this virus. Now, why does it cause some disease in some birds and not in others? Well, usually they're infected soon after hatch, and the immune system of the bird is not able to fight off infections that early, and when they're infected that early, then the virus actually lies latent in the bird and manifests itself weeks later. And hatcheries are they clean and disinfect and try to do what they can, but that's the reason why they vaccinate for Marek's disease right at the hatchery, because you want to get the vaccine into them as soon as possible before the wild type Merix gets in there and gets a foothold. And it's very important that these vaccines are kept at environmentally right temperatures and injected and vaccinated in the correct way. And we'll talk a little more about those vaccines later. Some of the things that Merix disease causes are tumors. You'll see tumors inside the body, and sometimes they're on the skin. Now, interestingly, at least in my experience, I've seen very little Merix disease in small flocks, backyard type chicken situations where tumors are involved. The most prevalent thing that people report are that my chicken is beginning to limp, or that it's got a wing that's starting to droop. And this is called the neural form of Merix disease. Pam asks a question about the time to vaccinate at home. And Pam, I'm going to put that on hold for just a minute until we get to the actual vaccination topic. And then if I don't address that, then slap me on the face by sending another one so that we can be sure and do that. There is an ocular involvement, sometimes called gray eye, in the birds. And if this is a terrible picture, I'm sorry about that. It kind of, let's see if I can't get my arrow down. There it is. If you look at that eye, it's out of focus a little bit, and the white part is actually a flash from the camera. But you can see that pupil is not completely round. It's got kind of an area down in here where it's irregularly shaped. And the Merix disease virus will cause basically a tumor in the eye that will make the eye go gray. Sometimes that iris, the brown part that you see out here, goes gray, and then you have this irregular pupil. But by far the most prevalent thing that we see is a bird that all of a sudden can't walk. This is a classic running profile of a bird, and you can see that it's kind of bruised up because it just can't get around. Now, what happens is that the nerves in the legs get infected with this virus in the lymphocytes, and it causes inflammation basically, and so then the nerve doesn't work properly, and they become paralyzed. Sometimes you can see a drooping wing. Basically, the sequelae of all this is that you have birds that are culls, and in the pecking order of things, if you don't remove those birds, they don't last very long. And so this is by far the way that I've seen Merix disease manifest itself in small backyard flocks. Now, these birds are about, I'll say, 20 to 26 weeks of age. Merix disease will manifest itself later once they become infected, and in some chickens it'll cause overt problems like this. But in a lot of birds, for some reason, the virus lies latent, and it causes no problems at all. And also in my experience, I've found that there are certain strains of chickens that are more susceptible to coming down with Merix disease problems like this than others. And there are some strains of your leghorns that are more susceptible, and also seabrights. It's a little small bantam type bird. There are certain strains of seabrights that seem to be very susceptible to it too. And by and large, every chicken will eventually become infected, but it's not going to necessarily manifest this. Now, we've talked about Newcastle disease before. We've talked about it when we visited the respiratory and the digestive tract. Newcastle disease will also cause some neurologic signs in some of the more virulent types of that. Exotic Newcastle disease, or sometimes we refer to it as END, is a very contagious and fatal disease. In fact, Newcastle disease is one of the most contagious diseases of poultry. This is a extremely virulent form of Newcastle disease, and basically we want to keep that out of the country. And when outbreaks occur, then we eradicate it as quickly as we can. In fact, these pictures from USDA APHIS are actually pictures of birds, and you can see that they have a lot of respiratory problems. However, with Newcastle disease, you can also have some neurologic signs. And the next twist, you might see a drooping wing, paralysis, some things that are similar to what you might see in Marek's disease, but oftentimes more exaggerated. And then also there's a high death rate with these very velogenic strains of Newcastle, which exotic Newcastle disease is. Now, if you remember in our discussion, I think it was with the digestive system, might have been with the respiratory, but we talked about different types of Newcastle disease, the velogenic, the mesogenic, and the lentogenic. And the lentogenic is the least, is the type of Newcastle that causes the least amount of problems, and that's what the vaccines are made of. But you normally have respiratory problems, decreased egg production, and thin-shelled eggs with those. The neurologic signs are usually associated with something more serious and require more attention. We also get some fungal infections in birds, and usually it's an aspergillus infection, but there's also a dactylaria that can cause this. The chicks may become infected in a hatchery even with these spores from the fungi that are floating around, or another way that they can become infected is through the brooder litter and brooder environment. And this is one reason here, one of the take-home messages here is that be sure that you use good, clean, fresh shavings or litter on your young birds. And even good fresh litter that has been exposed to rain or something and then brought in and dried out, that can cause a lot of problems because the spores actually, the fungi actually increase, and then they form the spores, and then you don't see it in the litter, and so the litter looks pretty good, and then the birds start walking through it, and it makes these little spores come up, and then they breathe it in. And sometimes this is called brooder pneumonia because it'll lodge in the lungs, and when you open up the dead birds, they basically die of pneumonia, but you can see a lot of little marble-like things in the lungs, very hard, where the immune system of the bird is trying to lodge wall these things off so they don't cause any problems. However, the brain is also a part where these things can go to and lodge. And you can see stargazing, which is when the neck is kind of twisted around and it looks like they're looking upward. You can see incoordination. In this particular chick, he's very affected and can't even stand. And you can see the twist in his neck also there. So this is another form of neurologic disease that can cause stargazing and incoordination. So now we've talked about Marek's disease, we've talked about mycotic encephalitis, and we've also talked about Newcastle disease. You can just have some general bacterial problems that cause brain abscesses, and I apologize I didn't spell check this particular slide, and there's 2 mistakes on there, but I'll let you figure them out. And certain bacteria will lodge in a variety of tissues and organs in the body. Pasteurella multisida is one that causes foul cholera. You can find swollen joints, you can find pneumonia. Another thing that it does is that it gets into the inner ear, and it can cause some inner ear problems, and the chicken will not be able to be coordinated. It'll fall over, it'll cock its head in a funny way, and and that's because it's got an inner ear abscess basically in there. They can also lodge in the brain and cause other problems besides that too, maybe some paralysis or some other problems. However, the Pastorella organism is not the only thing that can do that, and just your general bacteria like E. coli. And this particular slide is of one that isn't too prevalent in backyard chickens, but it is quite prevalent in turkeys and in some broiler breeder operations. But it's called Ornithobacterium rhinotracheale, and it's a very pleomorphic organism, and there have been reports of that causing encephalitis in the brain too. And so there's a lot of different bacteria that can do that. I think you're starting to get the idea now that when a bird stargazes, loses coordination, cocks its head, or limps, there's a lot of possibilities out there, and a lot of them can't be determined without some diagnostic workup. This is really an important one as far as the commercial industry goes. It's called avian encephalomyelitis. We know it as AE. Sometimes it's called epidemic tremors. It's caused by picornavirus, and it causes problems in young birds. And so chicks that are 1 to 3 weeks of age are generally the ones that become that show clinical signs with this. However, it may lay dormant in there until they're 7 weeks or so old. But what will happen is you'll start seeing birds that can't walk. They don't want to move. You can look at them and they sit there and they look like they're shaking, like they're really cold. And if you pick the bird up and sometimes just kind of invert it in your hand, it'll make those tremors get really bad, and so then you can feel them. And that's where they get the name epidemic tremor from that. The birds that survive from this oftentimes will grow up a few weeks, and then you'll start noticing that their eyes look really milky, and they have cataracts, and it affects the eye, the lens in the eye, and they can go blind this way. However, the big importance in the commercial industry is not necessarily these problems early on, but if they become infected while they're in egg production, then what you see is a decreased egg production. And so you don't see the epidemic tremors, you don't see the cataracts, but what you will see is it affects the reproductive tract, and you'll get a decrease in egg production. There's no treatment for it. However, vaccination of breeders is what's used in commercial breeders, and then they will boost them at about 12 weeks of age on the young chicks that come out, the layers. And we'll look at that for a minute. AE is, I'm going to have to put I don't know on Pam's question on how AE is passed. I think it is egg transmitted, but I am not completely sure, and I'll have to look that up, and maybe as we go along here I can find that out for you. I know that it's extremely contagious early on, and so that's the reason why the breeders are vaccinated, so that they don't pass it on. And so I rather they shed it and the eggs become contaminated, or if it's through the egg. We'll find out for you on that particular issue. There's no treatment. However, vaccination of breeders is done, and that, of course, is to protect the young birds that are coming out of those flocks. Just a little bit about the basic immunology that we need to talk about. And this goes back to the question on passing things through the eggs. The hens will acquire certain immunity, and usually this is done by a vaccination program on the hens, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It can be just because they become exposed to it, to a particular virus. And then they produce antibodies, and some of those antibodies are passed into the egg, and then the chicks have some passive immunity. We call it passive immunity for about 3 weeks, and it depends a lot on what that organism is and how long that will last. But it's basically about a 3-week period before this starts to wane. This is a really important time in the bird's life, and the reason that this is so is that it gives the chicks a few weeks to kind of acclimatize, before they get infected with things. The immune system of the birds is not quite as developed as it is in mammals, but they do have a few organs that are very important in the immune system. The first one is the bursa fabricius, and this is, as we found out when we were looking at the intestinal system, it's right on top of the cloaca. And this is one of the first areas that accept antigens, or in other words, foreign things, and then they develop lymphocytes called B cells that will protect. In fact, even in humans, the term B cell is used, and it comes from the bursa fabricius. And then also they have a thymus, just like we do, and the thymus is down in the neck area of the bird. And these produce an immunity also, and they produce T cells. In other words, the ones that come out of the thymus, and each one has its specific role in keeping the bird healthy. The Harderian gland is an organ that only the birds have, and it's actually right above the top of the eyeball. And this is also, if you stop and think about things, the eye can get a lot of antigens in there. As they eat and they drink and they pick around the litter, and that's important in the immune system also. And then the other one is the spleen, and so those type of organisms or organs are important. Now they have lymphoid aggregates throughout the intestine and some other areas of the body. They don't have like lymph nodes. We have lymph nodes, but these are not really into a little bag like we have our lymph nodes. They're just more of aggregates of those lymphoid tissues throughout the body. Now the important thing is they become immunocompetent at about 3 to 4 weeks of age. And so this is important for vaccination considerations. For instance, if you're vaccinating for, let's say, bronchitis, and they have maternal antibodies, and you go in there and vaccinate at 2 or 3 days of age, actually what you may do is cause two things. First of all, the maternal antibodies may neutralize your vaccine, and then also that will cause them to become more susceptible to bronchitis maybe in 2 weeks instead of 3 weeks, because you've neutralized those maternal antibodies. And so you may not accomplish what you think you're accomplishing because the immune system can't assimilate that vaccine and say, hey, this is a bronchitis antigen, and so we need to make protection here with our lymphocytes and things. And the other thing here too is when we're talking about Marek's disease, we're going back to Pam's question, is that you've really got to vaccinate, whether you do it at the hatchery or whether you do it at home, within the first 2 or 3, the first 48 hours basically, and because you want to get that vaccine into them before that time. Generally speaking, it's best to have the hatchery vaccinate for Marek's disease. And while we're talking about it, let's just talk about it for a sec here, because it gets the vaccine into them sooner. They can vaccinate in the correct way, and they're protected. There's a number of types of Marek's disease vaccines, and most of these are made from chicken origin, although the original one was what's called HVT, and that's a turkey origin vaccine. And my recommendation is that if you vaccinate at home, you want to use an HVT vaccine, because then that way you're not inadvertently causing or seeding down your place with some chicken origin vaccines that may or may not be may or may not cause problems later on. Okay, let's look at some sample programs here. Okay, before we go on to this, I'm just looking in the book here. Vertical transmission is a very important means of virus dissemination for avian influenza. So that answers the question that it can come down through the egg on that one. So that's the reason why the breeders are vaccinated for that. Now, these layer vaccination programs will probably vary from places to places in the country, and so what I've tried to do is the HVT. Okay, before we get on to that, there's one more question from Donna. Is the HVT origin vaccine for Merrick's readily available for backyard flocks? What I will recommend that you do is get online and see what you can find on those things. In fact, here in a minute, I'll give you some companies that make vaccines. They don't make all the vaccines that we may talk about, but you can get on and see where their products are. So these vaccination programs are somewhat dependent on what the prevailing problems are in the area, but this is kind of a basic generic type program that most of the commercial folks will have done. Of course, Merrick's disease is really important, and that's done at the hatchery at day one, and then they start vaccinating with a series of vaccinations for certain diseases. And sometimes in really bad areas where infectious bursal disease is there, they'll go in and vaccinate for IBD at 2 weeks of age, and this is a disease that causes problems in the bursa fabricius, and it basically destroys the lymphocytes, so it destroys the cells that can fight disease. The next vaccines that they'll vaccinate for commonly are Newcastle and bronchitis. And notice that they'll start those in the water. Now these are done in the water. They use a lentogenic Newcastle disease and a multivalent bronchitis, depending on what's there. Multivalent just means there's different strains of bronchitis that they will put in there, such as Massachusetts, Connecticut, Arkansas 99, and that is somewhat dependent on what bronchitis viruses have been prevalent in their flocks or in the area before. Notice they do that at 4 weeks, and what's the reason for that? Well, because by then the maternal antibodies have gone away. There's no passive immunity, and also now the chicks are beginning to be able to assimilate those antigens and protect themselves against it. At 6 weeks, an IBD booster is often given, and then at 8 weeks, they'll go in with another water vaccination for Newcastle disease and bronchitis. Sometimes they'll go in with the same Newcastle as a booster, and sometimes they'll go in with one that's just a little bit hotter than the one before to kind of stimulate that immunity even more. And the bronchitis again is dependent on what's in the area. Now, what happens is you get a booster effect when these organs in the body are exposed to the same antigen again, and they say, hey, we've seen that before, and so they immediately start kicking out even more antibodies against that, and so you get an added kick from there. And then at 12 weeks, this is when the AE vaccine is given. It's actually given wingweb stick with a pox virus, and then some people will give a mycoplasma MG vaccination at this time too, depending on what's their MG status of their birds. Mycoplasma, if they get infected during lay, can cause some decreased egg production also. And then this Newcastle bronchitis booster is usually a killed product, so they have to go in and inject each individual bird. I have a couple of comments here. I have been able to convince one of our local feed stores to carry some of the poultry vaccines in small doses when possible. That's good, because that's one of the disadvantages of small flock vaccination, is that the dosage is is hard to get in small quantities. And Jackie makes a statement, I find it best to consider the cost per bird with the vaccine dose and not the fact that they come in doses of 500 to 1,000. That's true. You may have to throw some vaccine out, but depending on what you're vaccinating for and why, then it may be cost effective to do that. Okay, now just a quick sample broiler vaccination program. You have to remember that these broilers are only alive for about 46 to 47 days, and so they don't have a lot of time to develop any kind of immunity. But they will be given the Marek's disease at the hatchery. Typically, they're given a bronchitis and a Newcastle vaccination at that time too, and sometimes an IBD vaccine. Then they'll go in and booster that with an IB and a Newcastle. And some of the reason for the at hatchery vaccination is to kind of neutralize that maternal antibody, and then they can get in there and get a response at about 3 weeks of age with the revaccination. Laryngotracheitis, let's talk about that for a minute. That's a disease that and vaccine that usually requires some sort of a state or government approval to use. LT vaccines are live vaccines, and they have a tendency to revert to some virulence as they kind of smolder around, and so there's some danger in using those LT vaccines. In fact, even my personal opinion is that even the Newcastle and the bronchitis vaccines, if they're allowed to roll around in the environment a lot, you never know if they'll host adapt and what they're going to do. But the take-home message here is that broilers receive a minimal amount of vaccination and compared to the layers. And so I gave you those two examples just so you can see the difference in a flock that is going to last just a few weeks and a flock that is going to last a year or more over time. So now some of the challenges that we have in vaccinating small flocks, one that's already been addressed is the vaccines are difficult to buy in small quantities, and I don't know if you find a feed store that will do that type of thing for you, where it's broken down into smaller quantities. It's certainly to your advantage. But this is something it's always a challenge because of the reason why the vaccine companies are making vaccines. They're making multi-doses to service the commercial industry, which has thousands of birds. Marek's disease vaccination must be done at time of hatch to be optimally effective, and it also requires special handling. The vaccines that are effective, they're kept in liquid nitrogen. They have to be kept at a certain temperature. They have to be injected into the bird within a certain length of time to be optimally effective at that point. And we talked a little bit about already about Marek's disease, but some people will ask, well, is it worth vaccinating for Marek's when my birds are, I get them from the hatchery or mail order or whatever, and they come and they're days old and maybe even sometimes weeks old, and should I vaccinate or not? If they're 3 or 4 weeks of age, they're already beginning to become immunocompetent. And if they're exposed to the Marek's disease virus at that time, usually they're not going to have problems later on. But it's during that first few days is when it's the real critical state, and chances are that by the time you get them and you wait 2 or 3 weeks, they've either got it or they don't at that point. And so vaccination, it makes people feel good about it, but it's really not something that is going to be very effective, because at that point they're probably able to handle the virus and not cause much problem. One thing with Marek's disease, as we talked about before, is that if it does get into the birds early on, it goes into a latent stage, and then you start seeing problems basically when they start to become sexually mature. And sometimes usually Marek's problems will manifest themselves within a year, and that's kind of the benchmark that we use. But I've actually seen Marek's disease manifest itself in birds that are older than a year. But usually, if it's within a year, um, it's Marek's disease. And if it's in older birds and you start finding tumors and things in them, then you start thinking about the lymphoid leukosis, and that's a whole discussion in itself that is beyond the scope of this particular focus. Live vaccines may cause rolling reactions. Now, rolling reactions is a term that's used for a disease that kind of goes through a flock, and then it may cause some problems, but then particularly if you put replacements in there, all of a sudden they become exposed to this organism, and then they become sick. And the classic on this is with the LT rolling reactions. In fact, if you vaccinate for LT and you start you're getting birds from someplace and putting replacements in there, you can bet that you're going to start having real bad problems, because not only do the birds come naive and then they get infected with the LT vaccine, but that vaccine will start increasing in virulence too and cause some problems. And so particularly if you have multi-age birds, these rolling reactions can be a sequel of some live vaccines. And again, some of these may increase in virulence. We talked about the LT situation, and possibly some of these other types of vaccines too. You got to remember, most of the vaccines out there are live, and they're a live organism, and they can adapt. That's the reason why they become a vaccine strain, is because they've been manipulated or they've adapted to actually cause disease without causing a lot of disease. And that's how you stimulate the immune system, is you get something in there that causes a little bit of disease, and if it doesn't cause enough disease to kill the birds or cause a lot of egg drop problems or anything like that. Some considerations and cautions. Let's talk a little bit about why do you want to vaccinate? Well, sometimes you might have some valuable breeder birds, if they're exhibition type birds or some of these heritage strains, and that might be a consideration. Another one is exhibition, if you take your chickens to poultry shows. A rule that I've learned by hard and sad experience is that never take a bird to a show that you can't sacrifice if you had to. So on your exhibition birds, you want to keep your breeders separate from the birds that you actually take to the show. And be sure and you quarantine those chickens when they come back. You don't want to throw anything in there that you haven't done that with, and you can cause some real disease problems. And then, what are the prevalent diseases in the area? If you live in a place where everybody in the neighborhood is getting a certain disease, a bronchitis or something, then you may consider vaccination in those type of situations. And determining what you should vaccinate against. Again, you just don't want to vaccinate to be vaccinating and vaccinating for everything under the planet. But is there a reason why, and what is that reason? And the most likely one is that there's a disease that is going around that could cause some problems for your birds if you don't vaccinate. But you have to do your homework, and you need to know how and when the when to administer these vaccines. Each one is going to work a little differently. What ages do you vaccinate at? And, we talked a little bit about Marek's disease having to be done early on to be of maximum benefit. And then, do you do it in the drinking water? Does it have to go subcutaneous? Other ways that it has to be, such as spray, eye drop, and what are the types of delivery systems, and are you able to um, find the right equipment to be able to do the vaccinations with? And when it says subcutaneous, it doesn't mean intramuscular, and you've got to know the difference there and how to do that. And then the ramifications of using the vaccine. The replacement, if you have birds coming in as replacements and you're vaccinating for, say, bronchitis or Newcastle, do you want those replacement birds to become exposed to that? What are the possibilities of causing rolling reactions and in your flock? And then the other thing you've got to think about is what are the dangers to the neighbor's flocks? And a case in point would be if you got your hands on LT and you decided, okay, I'm going to vaccinate for laryngeal tracheitis, and you do so, and you've got a neighbor that's got some birds close by, and he doesn't vaccinate, that vaccine could easily get tracked over there, and then all of a sudden he starts having a problem, And so think of the neighbors too as you go through these vaccination programs. How do you handle and store vaccine? Do you stick it out on the hood of the car and let it sit in 90, 100-degree weather and expect it to work? Read on there, how does this vaccine have to be handled? For instance, the AE vaccine, you mix that thing up and it has to be kept cold as you administer it, and you've got a certain number of minutes that vaccine has to be given, or otherwise you're just going through the motions and not doing anything. And so not only know what vaccines you need to use, but also how you handle, how you store those vaccines, expiration dates, and so forth on that. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but I want to give you a list of some of the companies that produce poultry vaccines, and you can just Google these companies and get to the right page on them. But Zoetis is one, Fort Dodge Animal Health International, Elanco, and SIVA, and they will all have various vaccines, and not all of them may necessarily be available, and not all of these will produce all the vaccines too. One of the reasons why there's not a lot of vaccines, and for that matter even medications, is that it costs these companies a lot to go through the qualification processes for these things, and they've got to have the market available for them. So, but that'll give you at least a good list of starting points, and some of these companies will actually have representatives in certain areas of the country that you can talk to, and then again, talk to your local feed store and see what they have and what they can get for you too if you go that route. Yes, Jeffers is a good company for a lot of poultry products, vaccines, and equipment as well. And now, the take-home messages. You got to remember that vaccination is never a substitute for good sanitation and biosecurity. And sometimes we think of vaccines and drugs as that's really going to solve all the problems. Well, they're just ancillary tools to be able to help us in bad situations. You keep your birds locked up. You keep them covered so that they're away from the neighbor's dogs, from rodents and weather and everything like that. You keep them in good health. The immune system is based on the ability of the chicken to have enough health to be able to mount that response. And if they're stressed out all the time by being in an environment where they've got mites, they've got parasites, They're wet. There's a large change in temperatures between day and night. These are all stresses on the bird, and they'll never be able to get an immune response that's going to keep things away. And so if you have chickens that are stressed for any reason like that, get rid of the stresses first before you vaccinate, because they're not going to be able to handle the vaccine either, and you can have some problems vaccinating sick chickens. And then I can't emphasize this enough, is if you don't have a problem, don't create one. And if you've got chickens and they're doing fine, don't lie awake at night worrying about vaccination, because in most instances in small flocks, particularly in urban situations, you're not going to have a lot of exposure to these diseases, and unless you buy chickens that already have it, then you're not going to have problems. And so that goes back to the point, make sure you get your birds from reputable sources, and that they're not sick when you get them. But the worst thing you can do is get a healthy flock and then start going through a vaccination program simply because, well, gee, I've got to do something, to protect these birds. And generally speaking, in those type of situations, you're not going to have a need to vaccinate for basically anything. And in the long run, it's better to get rid of a sick flock than try to vaccinate your way out of it. And in fact, you cannot vaccinate your way out of anything. The only disease that I know of in the world that's been definitively eradicated by vaccination, and that's smallpox. And they say the rinderpest is out of at least the domestic population of cattle, and they claim that that's a eradicated disease too, but that could have some sources that in the wild that's keeping it going. We just don't know that. But other than smallpox, that's it. And so vaccinating a flock of chickens in the backyard to try to get rid of something is not going to work. And once you start vaccinating for anything, you've got to realize that you may end up having to vaccinate all the time, and diseases will shift, they'll change. 30 years ago, the bronchitis viruses that were out there prevalent were vaccinated against, the Massachusetts, Connecticut type, Holland. All of a sudden now, about 20 or 25 years ago, the Arkansas 99 came up. It was a change that organism had mutated, and there's mutations all the time on those bronchitis vaccinations, and so they'll find a way to cause a problem some way or other biologically, and so you can't vaccinate your way out of it. Use biosecurity as principles as your firewall. We talked about those in the second lecture. And if you need to go back and review some of that, then go ahead and do that. And the last thing that I want to leave with you here on the messages is consult with a veterinarian when planning a vaccination program. Just don't willy-nilly go out there and do things, or as I mentioned before, you may end up with a problem that you don't want and that you've created. And so let's see, are there any questions here? I thought I saw one.
Yeah, are some of the diseases more virulent or prevalent during certain times of the year?
Yeah, in fact, a lot of that has to do with the stress factors on your birds and things like that. One of them that seems to be well, it's not one of these neurologic problems, but we talked about earlier, and that's your coryza, your gallinarum infection that caused the eye and the sinus problems and things like that. That seems to be more prevalent in kind of warmer, wet weather and environments like that. And so there are some regional differences. That's the reason why you really kind of have to know what's going on in your area. But generally speaking, you're not going to have much problems as far as overt diseases go like this, if you follow a good biosecurity programs, and just think of what the birds need. You know, you don't want to live in a situation that's cold and damp and wet, and so make sure that in their coop um, they have dry litter, they have good fresh water, and if it gets really cold, then just drop a light bulb or something in there to kind of to take the chill off. And so, if you just use good animal husbandry practices, you'll be okay. If you do get a problem, though, the best thing to do is to check with a veterinarian and get it diagnosed in a diagnostic lab. Like I say, a lot of these diseases look the same. I don't think there's any of us that have gone through this series here that hasn't been able to figure that one out. That just because you have a sick chicken, a lot of times you can't tell what's wrong with it until you take it to the diagnostic lab and find out. And then if it's a serious problem that that you need to deal with, you can either vaccinate or get new birds, depending on what it is. Of course, if it's a pet, that's a different situation than if it's just a few layers in the backyard for eggs. So,
Any other questions? Just type them in the chat box. And while you're doing that, I will just mention that the next webinar that we have is on getting started with poultry production. It's an evening webinar designed for 4-H kids. So if you have any 4-Hers that are looking to have a layer project, oh no, wait a minute, that's the May one, sorry. The April 20th one, getting started with poultry production, is actually a Michigan State webinar, not one of ours. You have to pay to participate in that one. Our next one is May 4th, getting prepared for pullets for a 4-H egg enterprise. So if you have any kids, that's an evening one. Our June one is alternative to antibiotics in poultry production. And we are working on getting one on first aid for chickens and one on different meat quality problems with the green mussel disease, the woody mussel, various things that have been seen in larger, more commercialized small flocks for meat production that have been seen. So, with regards to getting your birds diagnosed, now more than ever, it's important because of the avian influenza situation. If you haven't been following that, check out the Facebook page and see what's been happening. It's a devastating disease that affects not only the flock that's infected, but neighboring flocks and the poultry industry as a whole. And we don't want to. The alternatives to antibiotic session is June 12th. And if you go to our extension.org/poultry, you can see all of those, and as well as the new ones we get posted. And if you go to the Facebook page, then we'll post as new things as I get them scheduled. So there is a past webinar on avian influenza and the situation that was happening in Washington State. It has since spread to Minnesota, Idaho, Kansas, Missouri, California, Oregon, various different states. So keep abreast of whether or not it's in your area, and if you get any sick birds, to get them tested. Are there any questions now that I've rambled? Not seeing anybody typing. I'll say thank you very much, Dr. Frame, for the presentation. It's been a good series on poultry health, and I hope the others that haven't seen it will go back and review some of the earlier webinars that we've done. And I'd like to thank the participants for coming and actually participating in our webinar. So thank you very much.
well, I appreciate the the opportunity to do this. I've had a lot of fun, and participation is important, and I hope that that's answered some of your questions. And it's been a pleasure these last few webinars to be with you, and thanks a lot.
Okay. We're finished.